During one of our travels, my friend and I stayed in a small town to rest for the night before heading to our main destination. While we were there, we came across an old movie theater when we strolled away from the hotel. We still had a couple of hours to spare, so we decided to see the movie just to experience how it was. Little did we know, the experience that we would have in this shoddy building was not exactly what we had in mind. Abby and I just wanted to kill some time by looking around the quiet and somewhat isolated town. It was new to us since we lived in the city, and it was less likely for us to come back there ever again. Even though it was relatively late, it felt odd to not see a single person out on the streets. We found the old and small establishments quite interesting, but what caught our attention the most was the town's movie theater. The building was far past its prime. The paint was already peeling, and the sign was missing some letters. In addition to its dreary condition, the ticket clerk seemed uninterested in doing her job. We'd never heard of the movie that was being played. The poster looked like a hand-painted drawing of a child for a hack-and-slash movie, but we couldn't care less about it. Right on the get-go, it was already far from the cinemas that we were used to. The hallway was far narrower, which only a single person could walk in one lane at a time, and the scruffy red carpet full of tears and runs were lit by a row of flickering yellow lights. The door to the theater itself was heavy and creaking, and there wasn't any light at all aside from the big screen that faintly illuminated the big space. There were a few people that were already seated, and it was too dark for me to see their faces clearly. The movie had already begun. Abby and I went to the front row to see what it was about. The early scenes were just a bunch of grown-ups wearing different animal masks and fooling around with shaky shots. There were hardly any scripts, and they were just flexing the sharpness of their blades by chopping off random things inside a basement. The movie looked like it was made by a bunch of guys who happened to own a camera. It was easy to tell that the blaring heavy metal music was being played during the shoot instead of being inserted in the editing, and we both cracked up when the wife of the cast upstairs yelled at them for being too loud. It was more terrible than a bunch of indie filmmakers who were genuinely trying to produce a half-decent movie. The quality of the costumes were so terrible that it was laughable, and there wasn't any structure in the storytelling at all. We couldn't hold our giggles since the beginning of the movie, and Abby was already speaking her mind by pointing out some insulting remarks about the production. I kept on telling her to keep her voice down so we wouldn't bother the other people in there, but I sounded so insincere since I couldn't stop myself from laughing either. I was constantly checking my phone, but we were not getting any signal inside the building for some reason. Regardless of the place and how cheap it was, I wondered why a movie theater would screen such a terrible film. The perspective eventually turned into a person on view, and the blokes in masks began chopping off stray animals along the streets and the backyards of their neighborhood. The movie finally showed a specific genre despite of being awfully made. It turned out that the theme all along was mindless violence and gore, which was a common slasher film popular amongst low-budget productions. Even though the delivery was pretty bad, the idea behind the story was easy to understand. The movie was about 4 grown men who were bored with their ordinary lives, and they would turn aggressive and violent whenever they put their masks on, like having an alternate personality. One was of a clown with a samurai sword, the other was a pumpkin with a chainsaw, the third was a skull head with an axe, and the fourth had a mask of a crying child while wielding a bolo blade. Either way, we were having a good laugh, so the details didn't really matter. Abby and I were just chatting as it played, and the other people in the theater didn't seem to mind the noise we were making. Halfway through the film, I stood up from my seat and went to the restroom. It was then when I discovered something that made me feel uneasy. As I was walking my way back to my seat, my attention was caught by one of the guys in the back row when the light from the big screen reflected from his glasses. He turned his head towards me when he caught me looking at him, and then I was surprised when I realized that he was one of the actors in the film we were watching. He heard all of the bad things that we said about the movie. Even though I couldn't see the expression of his face clearly, I knew that he was fiercely glaring at me. It felt really embarrassing. I wanted to apologize for our behavior, but I ended up just lowering my head instead out of shame as I hurriedly returned to my seat at the front row. I whispered to Abby what I saw, and I asked her to refrain from insulting the movie. It felt really awkward being in there with one of the cast, so we decided not to finish the movie. But as we were about to get up from our seats, the following scene that played on the big screen had caught us completely off guard. The characters were slashing things up while blasting their music in the basement once again, and the wife unsparingly ran her mouth from the second floor since the shoot was being too loud. The husband of the complaining woman put on his mask and grabbed his axe, and the other 3 men followed his lead. They went upstairs to finally confront her. However, they didn't come to simply argue with the wife. The husband himself swung his axe and stuck it right in her chest. Abby and I were completely dumbfounded by the sudden turn of events. Up to that point, they were only venting their rage through random things and backyard critters. The production clearly did not have a budget for realistic effects, but the scene looked disturbingly real. After the first kill, they went on for a bloodbath. The following clips were a series of gruesome murders done with an axe, a samurai sword, a chainsaw, and a bunch of other blades that the four of them had played with since the beginning of the film. To make things even more unsettling, we recognized some of the places where the scenes took place. We passed by some of the houses in the movie while we were walking around the outside the hotel, and there was a particular house that we could clearly recall since it was covered in barrier tape as if a crime had happened. On the next gruesome scene, there was no denying that it happened right where we're staying. The shot was taken inside one of the rooms at the hotel where we checked in, and they gutted the victim right on his bed. Just when we thought that it couldn't get any more disturbing, the next scene brought chills right down my spine. It was shot right in the theater, and a couple were murdered on their seats while they were watching a movie. As I looked at the exact seat they were killed, the tear on the cushion made by the axe was still there. At that point, we were starting to think that the murders in the scenes were actual crimes. I was already shaking out of fear as I held Abby's hand since one of the cast was sitting just behind us, and Abby screamed her heart out when she turned her head. The few people in the theater were the four killers in the movie, and they were wearing their masks and wielding their blades. I grabbed Abby's hand and ran out of the theater as fast as we possibly could. One of them threw an axe right at me, but I was able to dodge it. Luckily for us, we were able to outrun them. As we passed along the other establishments, all of them were suddenly closed. We headed back to the hotel and went to the front desk to tell them what was happening, but there was nobody around. We checked the log on the table. We were the only ones logged in. We jumped into the car and didn't even bother to take our things from our room. It felt as if the people remaining in that town were aware of what the four killers were doing, and they just decided not to do anything about it to keep their businesses running. We stormed out of the town without looking back. It still disturbs me even today whenever I recall the movie that we saw and we almost got killed in the same gruesome way.